Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. One of the things that I regularly will tell audiences that the most valuable commodity that any of us have is how we choose to spend our time. And so I'll just start by thanking you for spending your time here. I think you'll find that it is well rewarded. For those of you that I haven't met, my name is Tony Chinadis, and I'm the director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. This is one of several interdisciplinary university-wide institutes on campus. And our purpose is to catalyze interdisciplinary research on a wide range of issues that have the characteristic of being, first, important enough to matter in the unfolding of the human condition, and secondly, that unfold over a period of decades and are thus, almost by definition, difficult to deal with in terms of public and private decision making. We have worked on and we continue to work on a wide variety of issues, from environmental issues to economic issues and political issues. And our reason for being in the university is to highlight the kinds of research that's necessary to bring new understanding and improve decision making on all scales. Perhaps the most enjoyable part of my job as director of the center is to, each year, I get to select a distinguished lecturer. And really what that means is I go through the list of people who I think the university community would benefit the most from hearing from, and then try to persuade them to come to campus, spend a day or a couple of days with us, talk to faculty, talk to students, and share their thoughts on a topic of their choice with the broader university community in this lecture. We are incredibly fortunate this year to welcome Marcia McNutt, the president of the National Academies of Sciences. If you've grabbed one of these brochures on your way in, it has Marcia's, a little précis of Marcia's bio in here. So if you're looking for inspiration, I suggest you read it. Because as far as I can figure out, Marcia has done pretty near everything there is to do, both in academic science and in leading important institutions, both important private institutions, scientific institutions, and now public institutions, in a way that is almost unique amongst eminent scholars in our world. She's been president of the AGU. She has been the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. She's been editor of Science, and she is now president of the National Academies. Has been honored by scientific societies more times than nearly more times than one can count, and brings to this lecture, I think, and to this discussion, both a wide range of experiences, but truly deep thinking about the nature of the kinds of challenges that we must address over the next decades to come. So I'm incredibly excited about this, and I hope you are as well. Before I ask Marcia to come up, I want to recognize just a few people. I want to recognize Cynthia Barakat, Teresa White, John Prandato, who worked extremely hard to put this event, from the Pardee Center, who worked extremely hard to put this event together. As many of you know, we actually changed venues really kind of at the last minute, and so coping with that, making sure that everything was organized was a tremendous accomplishment. After Marcia delivers her results, I'll come back up and we're going to do as we've done in the past and open a conversation where we'll try to prime the pump a little bit for discussion and questions, and then we'll open this up to Q&A from the audience. There are microphones on either side of the room, and there's one mobile mic, which I think John can also bring around. I will ask you to use the microphones. We're webcasting this and recording it. And so we want both the current audience and audiences to come to be able to hear what you're asking and really hear the discussion. When we're done, there's a reception which will be through these doors for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Not too long. It's a school night. So with that, Marcia, let me ask you to come up.
Thanks so much, Tony. Well, thank you very much, Tony, for that introduction, and special thank you for the Pardee Center for inviting me, to Bob Brown and to BU for having me here, and I'm really grateful for everyone who made this possible. So, the title of my talk, The Past, Present, and Future of Truth. It was an easy decision to decide to come give this lecture simply because the Pardee Center is looking to the future. And I was just intrigued by the opportunity to think into the future of what will we be thinking about in terms of how we look at scientific truth in the years to come. And the inspiration for this talk, one looks no further than this. The Oxford Dictionary's word of the year for 2017 was post-truth, where Oxford Dictionaries noted that this word was being used to describe the post-truth era that we had entered. And what does that mean? Well, there are many definitions of post-truth, but some of the ramifications of being in a post-truth era are that feelings and intuition are valued over scientific analysis, that expertise is not respected in the same way that it had been, and that in some cases, scientists were being viewed as just another special interest group. So, how did this come about, and what can we do about it? Well, first of all, does truth matter? Well, I'm going to argue that yes, it does. Let's talk about just the vaccine issue. I'm sure there's probably no one in this room that isn't aware of the problems we have right now with vaccines and the reemergence of childhood diseases that we thought had been eradicated. And so we have world leaders who are tweeting out misinformation about vaccines that could encourage parents not to get their children vaccinated. We have parents that are protesting vaccines under the parent choice argument, not realizing that there are many vulnerable children that actually cannot get vaccinated because their immune systems are too vulnerable. And because they cannot get vaccinated, they have to depend on the herd immunity from other children. And when healthy children do not get vaccinated, it puts all the others at risk. And we've even seen, this lower one is from Australia, billboards going up trying to question whether vaccination is actually needed. Now, this is not an issue of scientific debate. For many decades, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have been putting out documents on the safety of vaccines, on what the relative risks are of vaccination versus not vaccination, looking at all of the data in gory detail on vaccines, showing their safety, looking at the specific issue of vaccines and autism, showing that this is not a link, and yet there is still this misperception going around that there's vaccines are a matter of choice. And so what happens? Well, we've seen the Disneyland measles outbreak was one example that was blamed on the anti-vaccine movement. Started in Disneyland, spread to many states. Some of you remember the situation in Minnesota where many young children and even some adults died when a particular immigrant community decided not to vaccinate. So truth really does matter. When you ignore it, it impacts life and death decisions. So here's another example. Does HIV cause AIDS? Well, here was the president of South Africa who publicly denied for a long time that HIV caused AIDS. He blamed the disease instead on poverty and racism. Now, the National Academies had a report on this topic as well. It came out in 1986. The report from the National Academy confirmed that HIV caused AIDS, and it went on to say that HIV had the potential to become a public health epidemic in the US. It would not be a disease that was confined, what was thought at that time, to the intravenous drug using community and the gay community, that it would spread to other populations and become a public health crisis. So in this report, the National Academy urged the US government to start a program in public health to stop needle sharing and unsafe practices that were spreading HIV, and to start on a program on cures for HIV. That program was very successful. And in fact, during the Reagan administration, those recommendations were actually picked up and put into practice. On the other hand, because of the attitudes in Africa, this plot shows the change in life expectancy in a number of countries in Africa: Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Botswana, and South Africa. After decades of gains in life expectancy, all those curves started turning over in the 80s and early 90s because of AIDS. And the red line shows when the National Academies report came out. It was ignored in Africa, and people died, and died to such an extent that the overall life expectancy in those countries plummeted. But because the US took up the recommendations in that report, we did not have a public health crisis in this country. So why have we entered this post-truth era then, if science and evidence really do matter and they make life and death, they make a difference to life and death? Well, unfortunately, there is public skepticism with science. And one possible cause is a barrage of differing messages. You know, coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you. You see the same thing about red wine. Oh, red wine will lengthen your life. No, red wine shortens your life. And there are all these studies that the average person doesn't know how to sort out what to believe and what not to believe. So the problem is the public puts this kind of research in the same bucket as vaccines or AIDS. They don't distinguish that when the scientists say vaccines are safe, that's a very different kind of scientific pronouncement than coffee's good for you. When scientists say coffee's good for you, they haven't defined what does good mean and who is you, okay? Coffee may not be good for me, but it may be good for someone else. And so this is the problem with the messaging that we have. So no wonder the public gets confused. So what is scientific truth? Well, science seeks the rules that govern the behavior and evolution of the natural world. And by understanding those rules, it allows predictions on what the future would be if we do certain things, like will a vaccine prevent a terrible disease, or does HIV cause AIDS, or will stopping certain practices prevent the spread of HIV? And those are predictions that can be made when we understand the science. Scientists know that science is not a list of facts. But unfortunately, too many people are taught in school science as a list of facts. Now, fortunately, the education system is changing. And students now are being taught the scientific method, how to gather evidence. And so this is the scientific method. At the pinnacle of scientific hierarchy of truth, we put the method as what we believe in most in science. And it's the trusted approach to discovering those rules. And the method goes like this. You have to clearly state your hypothesis, you have to test it with evidence, you have to expose your work to critical review, you have to share your results, you have to show your data, you have to be skeptical of your own results, and you have to avoid bias. The results should be independent of who has done the experiment. Now, if you follow these results, or if you follow these rules, anyone can be a scientist. And so I would love to be able to go out to the public and say, well, if you don't believe vaccines are safe, you could be a scientist and you could go do the testing, but of course they can't. An average member of the public is not going to go do a test on vaccine safety because they don't have the resources or the wherewithal or the training to test for vaccine safety. So the problem is that truth gets wrapped up with the question of who do you trust? Because not everyone can become a scientist and establish their own scientific truths, we have to have some way to trust what other scientists have done. So next in the scientific hierarchy of truth, after the method, is the consensus. The consensus we also put up on a pedestal. It's the most trusted form of a scientific finding. Scientific consensus is hard won. Scientists don't like to agree. They love to disagree. They love to poke holes in each other's hypotheses. They love to find something new, not confirm something that is already known. But when they do agree and come to a consensus, it's a hallelujah moment. And so the scientific consensus that HIV causes AIDS or that vaccines are safe is a wonderful thing that it happened. And as I say, a consensus, it's hard won and it's hard lost. It takes a lot of evidence to overturn a scientific consensus. One that I've shown here is the theory of plate tectonics. When I was first starting out as an undergraduate, plate tectonics was first gaining acceptance as a scientific consensus. And it replaced an earlier ugly model that was so complicated that it was really difficult to even teach. And it was hard to overturn the old one, but this was so simple and so beautiful that it ultimately did. So, you know, paradigms do shift, consensus does change, but it's a rare thing when it does happen. Now, lowest in the scientific hierarchy of truth is an individual study. A scientific study is just a suggestion of what might be a candidate for a scientific truth, but it must earn trust. And so the public doesn't always distinguish between the study, which is just a suggestion of a truth, from the consensus, which is the hallelujah moment, yes, scientists trust this, from the scientific method, which is the way by which we find these truths. So the way I kind of look at this is, how many of you are familiar with the game Jenga, where you pile up the blocks? So I look at this as a game of giant Jenga, where the basis of Jenga is the scientific method. That's the foundation that everything is built on. And at the top of this platform is the scientific consensus, which is built on a number of individual studies. So the consensus relies on all these individual studies that have been built to the top. Now, it is possible to pull out one or two of these blocks if an individual study has been found to be wrong. You can have a flawed study or two and the consensus stands. But if too many of those blocks are pulled out because they are found to be flawed, then the consensus fails as well, and you have to build a new consensus up again with new, better studies. So that's my view of this. Scientists trust the scientific method. They trust the scientific consensus as carefully achieved on a foundation of individual studies. But if too many of those studies are untrustworthy, then the consensus needs revision and we have a paradigm shift. So let me talk about the past, present, and future of how we establish truth. Now, in the past, the good old days, which some of us scientists in the audience remember because we are from the good old days, this was an easier thing to do because it was a simpler time and a simpler world. We would simply ask a couple questions. We would say, and I'm gonna really focus on individual studies here, not on the consensus, which, as I say, is still hard won, and when it is a glorious thing. But how do we know when to trust and whether an individual study is actually truth? Well, in the past, we would ask the following questions. Was the work published in a peer-reviewed journal? If it was, then we think it's probably trustworthy. If it wasn't, well, it hasn't earned trust yet. It needs to get published. Then we'd say, was the work published in a really high-quality peer-reviewed journal? And we might trust it even more if it was in a really good journal. And we'd also ask the question, do the authors have a reputation for excellent, careful, quality-controlled research? And the community was small then. We sort of knew people, and we knew their reputation. So that was the good old days when life was simple. Okay, but then the research enterprise got really big. There was increased globalization. More papers are interdisciplinary. They're international. We don't know everyone. Increased social impact. Scientific research was known to impact health, the economy, the environment, quality of life. Research budgets are bigger. The stakes got really high. So what happened? Well, now science is disseminated through very diverse channels. There are now more than 2.5 million scientific papers published every year. So some of them are still published in journals. Some of them come out through preprint servers and don't go through peer review. Some of them are published in what are called predatory journals. And what's a predatory journal, you might ask? Well, a predatory journal is a journal with shoddy ethics that accepts papers and takes money from the authors in order to publish their papers, tells the author they are going to put it through peer review, but doesn't, just posts the paper up on the internet with no quality control at all. And so you may think the paper's gone through peer review, but it hasn't. So basically, seeing that a paper is published in what claims to be a peer-reviewed journal is no guarantee that it has had any quality control whatsoever. So publication is no guarantee of quality control. Secondly, there's the internationalization. This is a representation of scientific misconduct in 180 different countries over a time period that I think was like a 10-year time period. And this graph shows that there's an uneven distribution in scientific misconduct cases, but basically in the nations where the scientific enterprise was growing the fastest, scientific misconduct was most prevalent. So it appears that those countries had a difficult time as their research enterprise was ballooning, maintaining scientific quality control on the ethical issues in their communities. So if you have international authors, knowing whether they share your ethics is a major problem. You don't know who to trust necessarily. And so this means that even for us on the inside, insiders, researchers themselves, we're not sure how to decide truth, much less someone on the outside, a member of the public. So in the age of predatory journals, when there's no way to know the reputation of most researchers, when researchers from different cultures may not conform to our standards of ethics, and when the peer review system is at a breaking point because of those 2.5 million papers being published every year. So, how are we within the research community responding to this problem of the difficulty in establishing truth? Which papers can we trust? So the main response from scientists themselves is to push for transparency and reproducibility. So journals today are requiring and mandating things such as asking authors before they will publish their paper, have you made the data, the materials, the computer code, and the methods available for independent scrutiny, either by the reviewers, by the readers, by people who come after. You have to be transparent. You can't say data on file or materials were in my lab or whatever. All of this has to be available. Computer codes have to be posted so people can independently look at your findings and see if they agree. Your peers have to be able to do that. Secondly, have the authors declared all sources of financial support and real or apparent conflicts of interest. This is to get around that problem of bias. Could your results have been biased either by who supported your work or by other relationships you might have? You might sit on a board of directors of a certain organization that has a vested interest in the outcome of your study. All of these must be declared so people can read your result and read it with a grain of salt if they feel that it might have influenced the outcome. And third, journals are asking, are the findings and conclusions adequately resolved by the experimental design, the data, and based on appropriate use of statistics? Many journals are using expert statisticians to independently look at papers to verify that because of so many concerns that scientists have not appropriately resolved their conclusions based on inappropriate use of statistics. And then, finally, the golden ring, or the big brass ring, would be to ask, have the results been independently replicated? And actually, a journal in political science, before they publish their papers, they have an independent testing group replicate the results before they will publish that paper. So good for the political scientists for setting a very high standard there. But at least having all the data and materials and methods and computer code available means that ultimately other scientists, if they're either curious about the result, they want to extend it, or they're very suspicious of it, are able to do that if they want to and can write a comment on the paper if they either successfully replicate it or they don't. Okay, so let's look at some of the challenges we have facing us and how we need to be sure that we can get trusted information to the people who need it in this post-truth era. So here's one: how to feed the world without destroying it. The world's population is expanding, and we know that food production must rise. But how can we increase food production given limited water resources, given the problems of soil erosion, overuse of insecticide, eutrophication, which is overuse of fertilizers, and all the other problems with limited land use? We also want to have open space for wild systems as well. So this is a problem. So many thoughtful scientists and many in industry have proposed that genetically modified crops are a solution to the problem. They can be engineered to use less insecticide and to use less water in arid environments. So the National Academy, and I should say that use of GMOs is another one of those issues, like vaccination or like AIDS. These are issues that divide the nation on whether it's a good direction or a bad direction. And it divides the nation not on political fault lines, but on entirely different fault lines that are not aligned with typical political affiliations. So in 2016, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine put out a report on genetically engineered crops, experiences and prospects. And we knew from the beginning that this report was going to be controversial because of how divided this nation and the world is on the use of GMOs. So what this committee did was they carefully screened all of the original scientific literature that was written on GMOs, looking at who funded the study. If the study was funded by Monsanto, ignore it. If the study was funded by some organization that is promoting non-GMO or holistic, purely natural products, then no, they probably had a vested interest. And so in the end, it was only a narrower group of studies that were felt by the committee to not have a bias one way or another in terms of having studied the GMO issue and be credible in terms of informing the report. They also screened claims for statistical resolution. If a study claimed that crop yield had increased, did it actually have the resolution to say that? Was there enough data and was there enough power in the study? Well, basically, what this report found was that there was no evidence for harmful effects of GMOs on human health. They are perfectly safe for people to eat. There is nothing in the process of creating a GMO crop that alters the composition of the crop that would affect human health. However, they also found that of the crops available today, there were no clear benefits of the crops being used in terms of less insecticide use or reduced crop loss. And they concluded that greater benefits would be derived from public funding of GMO development, because right now, with the funding coming from industry, industry is designing these crops so as to boost their bottom line, not for public benefit. And public funding would increase the public benefit of GMO. So for example, one crop that everyone knows is Roundup Ready corn, that it can be planted right after Roundup is put on a field. Well, of course, that's designed to encourage use of Roundup. It doesn't necessarily boost the yield of the corn. So designing crops for public benefit would be in the public interest. So let me give you another example where careful work to look at truth is in the public interest. And that's the issue of legal truth. So legal truth, unlike scientific truth, which is trying to understand the natural laws that govern the universe, legal truth wants to discover who, what, where, and when something happened. It allows justice to be served by knowing those facts. And where science intersects legal truth is the topic of forensics. So how many of you have watched CSI? All right. So CSI is a television show that is based on taking the science of forensics to an extreme. If you watch CSI, you are convinced that science will solve any crime. You kind of wonder, how could the bad guy ever get away with how good science is at finding evidence and pinpointing the bad guy? Well, so the National Academy did a report in 2009 that looked at forensic evidence. Looked at blood spatter, fingerprints, bite marks. It looked at the striations on bullets, bullet striations. It looked at hair follicles. It looks at drug analysis, all sorts of things, and just said, how much science is in forensic science? Eyewitness testimony was an important one. And what the report actually concluded was not that all of this was bad, but it just didn't have a scientific foundation for it. That most of the forensic science had been done by police labs who basically did not use the scientific method in coming up with their approaches for comparing the evidence with the possible candidates for conviction. And so there was no statistics to say, if you have a partial fingerprint, and here you have someone's full fingerprint, how can you say from the full fingerprint what the confidence is that it's a match to this person and it won't match 15 other people out there in this same city? No one could answer that question. No one. And one particularly disturbing test of this report after it came out was hair as evidence. After the report came out, one enterprising lab, I think this was down in Texas actually, went back and they looked at all their convictions using hair analysis, where someone's hair was used, and they said, oh, we got a hair at the crime scene, we've arrested this guy, look, the hair matches his, and so he's going to jail. Well, because DNA came out, they could actually go back and look at the DNA in the root of the hair and compare it to the guy they convicted. In 1 out of 9 cases, they had the wrong guy. That's more than 10% false conviction rate. So that's not a very good situation. So, based on that report, there are actually 3,000 death row inmates that are having their convictions under appeal. So that's a lot of possible cases. I mean, many of them are maybe guilty, but many of them might be innocent as well. So as a result of that report, the Justice Department set up a committee to actually put forensic science on a firmer basis, because there's no reason why there can't be good science behind fingerprints and blood spatter and things like that. It just needs to be done. The Academy report didn't say all of this evidence is trash. It just said you have to have proper statistics behind it and proper scientific analysis for using it. So there was a group of scientists that was working with the Justice Department to do it, and then the group was disbanded and it went away and it's no longer happening. So that was too bad. There's problems when leadership is not willing to use science, and that's a problem with truth. That's a problem with truth, is when leadership won't embrace truth. But the final problem I wanted to mention is that science can also be messy. And that's also an issue that we have with science, and one that I'm not sure I know what the answer to. So here's a report that the Academy put out in 2016 in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. The report was on the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. And the report's bottom line was as messy as the problem of immigration. It basically said that first-generation immigrants, the first people to enter the country, whether legal or illegal immigrants actually, cost taxpayers in social services, but their children and grandchildren pay back that investment many-fold. So we have to invest in these new arrivals, but we get it back many-fold with their children and grandchildren. That immigration has an overall positive impact on economic growth, innovation, and entrepreneurship, but those benefits are unevenly distributed over space and time, because immigrants contribute positively to the federal budget, but they can be a drain at the state and local level, because the immigrants may come into gateway communities where they're a drain at the state and local level, but then when their children and grandchildren pay that back, they're paying it back away from the gateway communities at the federal level often. So that's why this is such a messy problem. Now, when we put this report out, immigration suddenly became a big issue in the 2016 election. And so, not surprisingly, this report was cherry-picked. Cherry-picked by the extreme right and cherry-picked by the extreme left. So here's an example of some of the headlines that came out of this report. From the Huffington Post, immigrants don't steal your jobs and wages, billionaires do. It's hard to find that anywhere in the report, believe me. And from Breitbart News, National Academies study shows 500 billion immigration tax on working Americans. So these both came out of exactly the same report. So as I say, science is messy, and so it's kind of hard to message it in a way that the average person will understand it. And that leads me to this, the two worlds. Science is practiced versus what the public wants. So as a scientist, I know that it's most interesting if I've got a discovery that's a major advancement on some topic, or if it overturns an accepted view, if I actually can change people's minds on something. Whereas the public wants the consensus because it reduces confusion. Many are taught science is a body of facts, and they don't like it when scientists change their mind. So they don't like to see science as practiced. They just want the facts, and they want them to be eternal. Science is practiced. Remember, the tenets of science are that the results should be independent of who's doing it. So when we write our papers are very dispassionate. We write them as though anyone could have done that same study. We leave ourselves out of it. Whereas the public, they want to see that we're real people, that we're real humans, that we really cared about the result, that we cared about getting the answer right, that we're living, breathing, feeling people. But that's not the way we communicate our science. And then, of course, as scientists, all caveats and uncertainties must be included, whereas uncertainty makes the public think scientists don't know what they're doing. So this is why there is this struggle between how we practice science and what the public would prefer to see. So let me finally get to what the future, I think, is of truth. So in my future vision of how we can enter this post-truth world and hopefully do a better job of establishing trust with the public on the science and the science we're trying to deliver is in this post-truth world, scientists will learn to communicate better with the public and reach their hearts and souls, not just their minds. Because as scientists, we're so used to talking to other scientists on a cerebral level. But that doesn't work when we're talking to the public. The public doesn't want to hear things just on a cerebral level. We need to get them in their hearts and souls because they want to know that this is not just cold, hard stuff, that it really matters to them, and it mattered to us that it matters to them. And hopefully scientists will become more professional at signaling what they trust and what they no longer trust or never trusted. And I'll get to that next, because I think as scientists we don't do a very good job of that. And I'm hoping in this post-truth world that non-scientists will better understand that science is not a list of facts, but an ordered way of knowing the natural world, which is subject to revision. And that non-scientists will become more savvy consumers of scientific information, knowing that it provides the key to a more prosperous tomorrow, and they will embrace that. So what do I mean about signaling what we trust and what we don't trust? Well, you know, as I say before, we looked at whether something was peer-reviewed. Now we have no way of knowing whether things are peer-reviewed, and I think we need to. I think we have to have some way of showing what has been peer-reviewed and the quality of the peer review. I think we have to show that something has been reviewed for proper statistics, for the power of data and experiments, for appropriate ethical reviews, like did it go through an institutional review board for human subject experimentation, that sort of thing. That the data and materials are available and that's been checked. If it's been independently replicated, that should be a signal of trust. And if we had a way to signal studies that systematically earn more and more trust as they would go through these various stages, then I think we as scientists would know better what we can trust, and we would signal to others too what we trust. So in closing, I'll just say we need science to inform many critical issues. Natural hazards, feeding the planet, getting sufficient energy, and science is one of the only ways that we have actually been able to make for a more prosperous future for more people without other people suffering. It's been a way that people get ahead without other people having to lose ground. And so we can't stop using science, but we have to use it in a way that people will trust it. So let me just close by saying, here's the National Academy building in Washington, D.C., and science without policy is still science, but policy without science is gambling. So I'll leave you on that and be happy to take questions.
Marcia, before I unleash the audience on you, you know, you've left us, there's a lot there to unpack, right? So this notion that a post-truth world is about the primacy of feelings and intuition over actual analysis and the scientific method. And you showed a lot of examples where the scientific community has in fact altered real-world outcomes. People lived instead of died. So why are we backsliding? What is it about the current, what do you think it is about the current culture that has, in some sense, sort of infected public discourse in a way that we haven't seen before?
Right. So studies that Pew have done, they've done surveys of Americans. And I'm happy to report that those surveys are still somewhat optimistic from a scientist viewpoint, in that they show that scientists are still held in high regard by Americans across the country. Scientists are still widely trusted. They're not as highly trusted as they used to be, but let me say this, everyone has fallen in public trust. So the fact that we aren't as highly trusted as we used to be is just part of an erosion of public trust overall. The only group that is actually more trusted than scientists is the military. So there's that. So I guess I'd say that it's not all bad news. Scientists are still trusted. And the issue of not trusting science is very limited to specific topics. And ones in which there have been strong campaigns by specific groups. So climate change is one in which there has been a very strong campaign. Some nuclear energy is another one where there's been a very strong campaign. The vaccine issue, which I mentioned. But HIV is actually a success story. So, and GMOs is one. So I think that those campaigns have very ardent groups who have managed to shout down the scientists, even though if you talk to those same people and ask them, do you believe science on every other issue but that one issue? They absolutely believe science on all the other issues.
Okay. So are we in a sense, are we in a sense, well, victims of two things. So I'll put this to you as a question. And one is the way in which we use the language of belief and trust, right? And so when we say we believe something, some phenomenon, increased greenhouse gas concentrations, heighten the greenhouse effect, and
we should never use the term we believe.
So this is the question,
we should never use that
right?
term, because it puts us in the realm of the Catholic Church. You know, we should not do that.
Right, leaving any particular church out of it.
Yes. Right.
But I think this is fair.
Nothing wrong with the Catholic Church. I mean, I helped the Pope with the encyclical. I think, the
right.
Pope has done wonderful things for climate change, but it's just, we don't, we know these things and we have evidence.
Right. So I think that's part of the key, right? So I work on climate change. I give lots of public presentations. When I inevitably, because I always get the question, why do you believe in climate change? And I stop the lecture. Yeah. It's the wrong word. It's not what we do. We have a community of people who delight in poking holes in each other's ideas and theories. If you've got better data, you win. That's the way this works. Yeah. But that's not very widely appreciated, I think, in general public discourse.
And words matter, and I really applaud you for recognizing the problem with the word believe. One of my favorite quotes was, I'm sure you knew Gus Speth, who was head of the program at Yale, and Gus told me once that he had a very ardent Yale alum who was in, I think it was Wall Street or something, come up to him and he was shaking his finger in Gus's face and said, I don't believe in the greenhouse factor or something like that. And Gus just said to him, well, it's a good thing for you that the greenhouse phenomenon does not care whether you believe in it or not, because if we didn't have the greenhouse effect here on Earth, life would not exist.
The other thing I wanted to I just talk to you about a little bit and get you to talk about is another way in which I wonder whether we're victims of our own success, right? So there's a tremendous emphasis in many of the sciences, perhaps not all, but in many of them, to be, as I put it, useful as well as interesting, right? We're doing research on problems that they may be messy, but they've got potentially large social impacts. Feeding the world, what to do about how to respond to climate change, HIV, AIDS, and public health, and a whole long litany of things. We inevitably, it seems to me, sort of get entwined in what appear to be sort of political or public arguments that are not really about the science, but they're about the implications of what's to be done, which is not, in fact, a scientific choice at all. It's a public choice. And how do we get out of that trap? Right? Yeah. Because those things are masquerade as, in a sense, as doubt about the science, when in fact there are arguments about what do you do?
So many of my colleagues don't like it when I say this, but I worry that climate science in particular has gotten a bad rap because too many climate scientists have, know the science very well and understand the implications of the trajectory we're on, and they take the next step of saying, therefore, you need to do this. And the problem with that approach is if whoever they're talking to doesn't want to do whatever they're told they need to do, the easiest way to try to avoid doing it is to try to find some way to discredit the entire premise of what they're saying. Whereas if instead the approach is, here's the climate science, this is what's happening, here's the evidence, here are the futures that we have. And these are the possible range of futures. If we don't like these futures, here are all of the choices we have, but maybe people can think of other choices as well, but this is business as usual, and if we don't like business as usual, we need to come up with something else.
Okay. A lot of what you talked about, and then I'm going to open this up, a lot of what you talked about as well really ends up on, we still have this reliance on trust in methodology, trust in institutions, so sort of a trust in the process of how we understand the world as a useful guide for what it is actually revealing to us. But that's, in one sense, that's easy for an academic community to understand because we've devoted the better part of our professional lives to either building that trust and maintaining that trust. But for most people, it is no more, or it seems no more than an appeal to authority. And so, how can we better explain why we trust that process and sort of why we trust the institutions that we do trust, and the provisional nature of that trust, and that's okay.
Yeah, so I think that's key here, and I think there are two things that need to be done. First of all is I think that we need to start by allowing every child as they grow up to spend time being an amateur scientist. so that they understand the scientific method for themselves and they feel like they understand the process of having an idea, going out and testing it, finding out if it's right or wrong, submitting it to their classmates to check, whatever. And they have a heuristic understanding for how that whole process works. So that they, and then they also understand the important part of criticism in the whole process. Because I think that a lot of the public don't understand that if it weren't for the critical nature of science, we would have a very sloppy house. And that is what tends to keep us honest and moving forward. But the other thing too that I think we shouldn't undersell is results. Results do speak for themselves. I mean, we just look around us at all the things that science has delivered for humanity. And it's pretty hard to argue with success. So I think we can make that point too. But social scientists will tell us that trust is based on two things. One is competence, and scientists always max out the scale in terms of competence. But the other dimension is warmth. For someone to be trusted, people have to feel that they're not only competent, but they have your best interests at heart. Because someone might be really competent, but how can you trust them if they're actually working against you? And that's where I think we as scientists could use a lot of help, because scientists score very low in warmth. We actually do worse than engineers, actually. You can believe that. Yeah, engineers, pat yourselves on the back. You are doing better than scientists in terms of warmth. So, you know, it's, so that's why I was saying in communication, we have to get to people's hearts and souls, not just talk to them on a cerebral level.
All right. So everybody who's way over on the INTJ scale on your Myers-Briggs test, raise your hands, because I think we're speaking to you now. So I'm going to, I got lots more things to ask you about, but I think I'm going to open this up to the audience. Microphones here, microphone there, microphone there. Please use them so that our colleagues on the web can hear what you ask. So just go up to the microphone and we'll go in whatever order you like.
All right.
Left, alternate, however you want to do it.
Yeah, why don't we just alternate one side to the other? So let's start over here.
Hi, thank you so much for a very profound and thought-provoking lecture. I wanted to ask you about the rank order of Amazon and the book order of Amazon plus the Google rank order that also shows things like the vaccines. You never see anything science popping up in the first page. And that is, again, one of the things that the public is misinformed about.
Okay.
And I know the CDC is sort of concerned about it, and they've talked about changing the order and making sure the right things are seen. People read a lot of literature on buying books on Amazon, looking at the ranking, and they think that that's science.
Yeah.
So how do you fight against that factor of rankings?
Okay, that's a great question. So Google actually came to the National Academy and they said, we have a whole bunch of topics where we know it was a consortium, it was actually Google and Bing. We have a whole bunch of topics where people are searching on these topics, and all of the information that is coming up is scientifically bad stuff. And there may be medically perfectly good information, but it's not geared to the public. And we're very worried because this is a matter of actually public safety. So we have a project with Google and Bing where we got experts to work with science writers to prepare web pages that counter the misinformation on these topics. Vaccines is one. A lot of other things like, will sucking lemons cure my cancer? Google it. You're going to find, believe me, there are all these things out there. Oh my God, yes, I sucked lemons and my cancer went away. You know, and what reputable scientist is going to write an article on no, sucking lemons is not going to cure your cancer? So anyway, so we've written these articles, and now we're working with Google and Bing on how to get these to move up in the search engine, because basically Google and Bing are a little bit nervous about, shall we say, messing with the algorithms, but we might be able to work something out with them that it's treated like sponsored content or something like that.
Thank you.
Let's go over here.
So scientific method and peer consensus may lead to truth in the hard sciences, but there are many areas of public life where it seems less germane. Take, for instance, the case of the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, which were beyond messy. Should we just believe someone because they say something, or does the scientific method teach us that you need some sort of evidence of proof for what you say? Are there areas where we can suspend proof and believe in a kind of post-truth era where someone's word is good enough?
Well, you know, that's obviously not a scientific issue, and that hearing was not a legal was not a legal matter. If Brett Kavanaugh had been brought up on some kind of sexual harassment charge, then the legal definition of evidence would have been brought in, and there would have been a requirement for evidence. And you know, in legal cases, there, depending on what kind of legal case it is, there can be beyond a shadow of a doubt, and usually that's what's required for, say, a capital case or something like that, versus the preponderance of evidence, which is more likely in a civil case. So we'll never know what would have happened because that wasn't a legal case. So
right, but it's an important public decision that has to be based on some kind of truth too, regardless of whether it's a legal question. It's an important public decision.
Hi, I'm not sure that truth has anything to do with communicating with the public. I used to think, the way you did, that simply being clearer and communicating that lemons aren't going to cure cancer. If you did it in a one-on-one basis, you can make a difference. In fact, I put together a website called morelesstrue.org, which ranks scientific findings, some from crazy, like astrology, and then we talk about astrophysics, and then go through the story of Heliobacter and how that no one believed that that was the cause of ulcers, and now we do believe, and kind of plot that. So it's meant to communicate. And then I sat down with the PolitiFact people who won the, and they tell me that it is irrelevant that they rank the truth of politics, that they do it all the time, and they cannot move the 40% who are unwilling to believe what they know and is demonstrably true. And so there seems to be a real dichotomy here between the use of truth and getting to the last 50% of the people that we need to talk to, some of which are in dire need of the truth. And so to me, it seems like we're not solving the problem through this method, that we need a new method to work with people, because the old method, and the PolitiFact guys say their method isn't working. It's wonderful what they're doing, but it's not working in terms of changing the political dialogue, and I don't think we're going to change it either by telling the truth better, you know?
PolitiFact was talking about political facts, right?
Of course,
yeah.
Of course.
So I think it would be interesting to actually test whether their experience carries over to science. I think one of the best ways, of course, to change people's opinions about scientific facts is actually to, the best way is, I mean, the problem with what you did, let me back up a little, is that it's not just the message, it's the messenger. So the problem with a website is that it's coming from, you know, who knows who, with trying to communicate to people. The experience that I've had with talking climate change, for example, to people who don't believe in it. I have lots of friends who live in a part of California that is full of lots of climate change deniers. But we all go on a vacation every year together to the Sierra Nevada. And when we do this, we're up in the mountains. We've been doing this for like 20 years or so. And we've seen changes up in the mountains that are clear. And we used to take our kids up there, now we're taking our grandkids up there. And when I talk to them about these changes and how much we enjoy this environment and how climate is affecting these long-term changes, they see it, they know me, they understand it, and they change their minds. And it's because I'm a messenger, someone who shares their values, someone who's been with them, and that's different than having it on a website.
It's true, and there's lots of studies that show one-on-one's more effective than group, but there's also lots of studies that show by using cognitive dissonance to replace cognitive dissonance, you can cause people to have a break with their old way of thinking. All I'm saying is that our general method is just to do science better and talk about it, whereas you actually need a different methodology to talk to the public, which is separate from what we do.
But that's why I was saying, get to their hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. And that's what you do with people when you spend time with them and you share their values. And then you talk to them about how those values are at risk. Yeah.
I'd like to turn the spotlight away from the question of the personal likability of scientists, which I grant you is a problem, and talk a little bit about something you haven't mentioned that I think is contributing to the problem, and that's the institutional arrangements surrounding science and within the scientific community itself. Okay. I study human evolution.
Okay.
I needn't tell anybody in this room that we have been confronting this problem of the absence of public trust in consensus, scientific consensus, for over 100 years, and in the fraction of that time, the Gallup poll people have been taking polls on public acceptance of the proposition that most of your ancestors were fish. I'm sorry, but they were. That needle hasn't budged off the 40%, no matter what we do. Okay, well, that may be our problem, but I think that this kind of problem has become, during my lifetime in science, more and more pervasive. And I think there are some reasons for it that are built into the structure of the way science has, the way the working of science has changed. And one of the indexes of this, in my experience, is the enormous increase in the level of personal insecurity and fear and dread among young scientists and graduate students in the present environment. They do not have any confidence in their own futures. They don't have any sense of personal security in their jobs. In this environment, there are two or three things that naturally tend to happen that I think contribute to the erosion of public trust in science. Okay, one of them that you did speak about, which is the multiplication of predatory journals, of unrefereed sources of dissemination of shoddy information. There's some other things that are going on, some of which we prize highly, and I'm not sure we should. For example, it has become more and more, continually more and more prevalent throughout my lifetime in science to find that the people who employ scientists prize the scientists for the amount of research grants and overhead that they bring in. And this is dependent in part on the size of the research operation that they maintain, which is in turn dependent on the number of graduate students they have. And as a Darwinian, I immediately say, aha, Malthus. Okay? And the problem is that the number of, we turn out far more people, far more trained scientists than are needed to replace us. And probably more than the ecosystem can support. And so there is a desperate struggle for existence, just like Charles Darwin told us about. And one of the signs of this is a tendency to desperately seek some way of announcing an innovative scientific discovery when there isn't one. Because your grants depend on it, the public interest depends on it, the attention that you get from your employers and your superiors depends on it. And every time I turn around in my own area of expertise, I find somebody having a press conference and a media event to announce the discovery of an exciting new breakthrough that has completely thrown into disrepute everything we thought last week. And most of these new discoveries are things I've known for 60 years. Like just last week, somebody announced Neanderthals did not drag their knuckles on the ground when they walked. Well, we've known that since the 1940s, if not longer. But there's an enormous pressure to attract attention, to announce novelty, and to say that you have now discredited what went before and everything is different. And I think that environment, which is generated to a considerable extent by the institutional structures of science, may be one of the things that's contributing to the erosion of trust.
Thank you. Okay. Question.
Thank you for your insightful lecture. I actually have two questions, if I can ask them. One is pretty quick. It's something that you said that kind of made me think of it. You mentioned that when scientists take this extra step and kind of tell people what to do, that it can contribute to this erosion of trust. So I'm curious on your take on whether something like vaccinations should be mandatory, or if you think that will backfire. And my second question is, I personally think that part of the reason people don't trust scientists is because I think there's a certain degree of elitism I see from science. An example, I once went to a lecture by a very famous scientist and science educator who I will not name. And while I respect him quite a bit, he did kind of sound a little bit condescending in parts of his lecture towards non-science people or other disciplines. I don't think he intended it, but I interpreted it that way, and I think a lot of people did. But then kind of like a related thing, I think, is that I think another example of this elitism is how science is in some way separated from the public, because we know that a lot of those a lot of the research is published in journals that you have to pay for, that an average person cannot get access to, because unless you are affiliated with a university, you just cannot afford it. And so I'm just curious what you think about this kind of like separation between science and the public, and do you think it contributes to this division that certainly exists today?
Yeah. Okay, so on your first question, no, I don't think scientists should be pronouncing that everyone should be vaccinated. These are decisions that should be made by public health officials, by communities, by states, by federal government. These are decisions that are important for the public to make on behalf of the public health. The job of scientists is to say, vaccines stop disease, vaccines save lives, vaccines are safe and don't cause, any adverse side effects are small and far less than the positive effects. And if you don't vaccinate, this is what will happen. You'll have the reoccurrence of these diseases. That's what scientists say. And then it is up to the public to decide what to do given these scientific facts. Now on the second part, so my own approach to this is, if I have a paper or a study or whatever that I think is of interest to the public, I will publish it in an open access journal so that anyone can read it free of charge. If I have a very nerdy, wonky paper that I know I can count on 2 hands the total number of people in the universe that could possibly be interested in it, then I probably don't mind putting it in a journal that is subscription only, because I know that the people I can count on two hands all have access to it, or I can send them reprints.
Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. Daniel Marino with the Master of Science Journalism program here. A question for you both. The solutions you mentioned, as I understood them, were improving scientific literacy for the coming generations, as well as tightening the checks and balances within science itself. These both seem like much longer-term solutions, which perhaps fittingly for the Pardee Center, but there are issues coming that are much more short-term. I think climate change is a perfect example of this. The measles outbreaks. The lack of truth and understanding has short-term consequences, but the solutions are longer-term. Do we just have to kind of eat the punches here, or are there shorter-term solutions to prevent some of these impending pains?
Oh. Tony, why don't you take that one?
So I appreciate the opportunity, but I was trained as an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, and now I work on climate change. So I've obviously made a bunch of bad career choices in this domain. So one of the things that I tell people, so I do these public talks a lot, and I'm doing one tomorrow night actually on climate change. And what I tell a lot of audiences now is that it's not my job to change your mind. It's my job to tell you the truth, or at least the truth insofar as I understand it, and to be really clear about why I understand the world the way I do. And then try to lay out, well, here's how we interpret the changes that we've already seen. There are places where I live on the New Hampshire seacoast that I can't walk at high tide that I used to be able to walk on when I was a kid. It's really simple. There's nothing complicated about it. Sea level has risen, and we can show the data as to how much. But the real world impact is that there's water in the streets at high tide without storms, and the northeasters that regularly occur in the winter are far more damaging than they used to be. It's just really very clear. The question then is, what do you do about it? And here I think we are, if we're being intellectually honest about what the science shows, you can talk about what are some potential approaches to how do you adapt, and what kind of investment would that take, and but the choice of what to do is not a scientific choice. It's a public choice. It's a choice that individual homeowners make, that business owners make, that public authorities make. It's not my choice. It's my job to try to lay out what the consequences of one path versus another are. So to the extent that I'm able to do that successfully in these public talks, the better I feel about it. And we are now in a situation where in a sense, it's easier to give this talk than I wish it were, because the real world consequences of this sort of rapid environmental change are increasingly clear and obvious to anybody who really cares to look, or who has a long enough past in a particular area to understand what they're seeing.
Yeah, and another thing that I do is I chaired the National Academies report on climate intervention, putting up particles in the stratosphere to change Earth's albedo. And that is such a scary proposition as to how it could fundamentally alter weather patterns and climate over the entire globe, that it often scares people into thinking, wow, if scientists are so concerned about climate change that they would actually think of doing something that radical, this has got to be a real crisis.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So I'm a scientist that both does peer reviews of other people's articles, as well as I submit my articles to peer-reviewed journals. So I really appreciate that you took a dive into the issue of how science is actually done these days, but I'm not as rosy as you seem to be, that most scientists really do things reasonably well and ethically. And just two quick comments. Number one, I found that most peer reviews of my articles were really terrible, very rushed. They didn't get into the details at all. When they were rejected, I thought it was ridiculous, but you can't even argue with the editors of the journal anymore. They don't want to listen. And when my articles were accepted, fine, you know, then no complaint. Flip side is when I review things, I don't want to accept any articles that aren't transparent. You talked about transparency. Well, I also work on climate change mitigation policy. So in the policy side, my experience generally is there's no transparency. The models that are used are never presented in the literature. There's all appeals to 26 articles, you know, that were published before a certain article. So if you can quote enough articles, that seems to substitute for doing careful analysis, or at least presenting the analysis in the article you're now publishing. So I see many problems that you didn't get into, but I'm afraid the scientific community needs a lot of reform beyond what you suggested.
Let me just make one comment on the overburdening of the scientific reviewer community, such that many reviews are rushed. Both the American Chemical Society and the American Geophysical Union did an analysis of their reviewer community relative to their author community. And what they found, perhaps not shockingly, is that their author community is completely international, but their reviewer community is male North American. And so with the men of North America shouldering the burden of reviewing the entire world, no wonder people are overburdened. We've got to spread the load.
Okay, time for maybe one more from each side.
Okay, all right. We've had too many soliloquies and not enough quick questions, so we've got to hurry.
I have a very quick question, and I just want to thank you for coming to Boston and braving the snow. What is your best advice that you give to the students in the room or the students watching in navigating this post-truth world and in moving to something beyond it?
Okay, oh, wow. I would say ethics is everything. I would just say that back to, again, this point about the messenger being important. And everything you do, make sure you aren't fooling yourself, and make sure you never fool anyone else. Make sure that everything you've done is to the highest standards. And before you publish anything, think to yourself, what would my strongest critic find to complain about? And make sure you've addressed that.
Last one.
Okay. Thank you for coming. I just wanted to say that. As someone who's entering this field, I'm a freshman here at BU in the Department of Earth and Environment. When it comes to convincing people who don't seem to want to believe the facts and the science, do you think that it's even worth the time of scientists and policymakers to try and convince these people? Or do you think it's just kind of a lost cause to some extent?
Well, if you know that someone is clearly taking a position because of vested special interests that are paying them or something like that, you know, there's no point in debating someone like that. I agree. I mean, scientists need to have an open mind, and they have a very hard time discussing scientific issues with someone who doesn't have an open mind. The scientists I trust the most are those who have delved into an issue and changed their mind on it.
Thank you.
Great. So I know there are other questions out there. We're about to go to the reception. You'll have plenty of opportunity to ask your
I'd
question.
be happy to talk to anyone who had questions at the reception.
Let's thank Marcia again. Thanks so much.